Hello and welcome to episode 5 of our podcast, Hope and the City. My name's Rob and this is Emma.
Hi, we're really glad to have you join us for this episode number 5, where we talk about what it is to live with hope, what things cultivate hope, what helps bring hope, how we can live a peaceful life and protect ourselves against those things that might rob us of our peace.
I think this is going to help people who have been taken by the grief subjects we've covered, but equally addiction, mental health, or just generally for everybody getting through the day. We hope you find this helpful. If you think that there's content we ought to be covering that we haven't yet, we've got a Q&A episode coming up. Please interact with us on email, hope@crplymouth.co.uk, and we're on all the socials as usual. We hope you enjoyed this episode. So it's actually the same day today as we're recording this that we've got to listen back to our episode with my dear friend Richard Garnett and your friend who you got to meet.
Yes.
But just 5 days before he passed away.
Yes. I think it was even less than that, Rob.
Was it? Wow.
I think it was even less than that. And what an honour that he took that time out and we were able to chat to him. And he was so honest and frank, wasn't he, about what he was up against.
I was trying to find the words. It was courageous. But he used the word excitement or exciting about 10 times or something, which just blew me away. And already, people have been listening to it from first thing this morning and feeding things in. And the reason we started this podcast is because actually we know so many people, don't we, who, you don't have to spend long talking to people before you hear a bit of their story, what they've been up against in the past, what they're up against now. And death is the number one statistic. So in fact, I sent a link to a WhatsApp group of 4 friends I grew up with, and one of my mates replied straight away, "I'll listen to this. I've been thinking about death a lot recently."
Wow.
Yeah. So people are thinking about it, we know that. And I guess perhaps this helps people talk about it. That can't be unhealthy, can it?
No, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I mean, there were so many things that Richard said, like in that podcast, that were just, I loved his analogy of being in the terminal lounge at Terminal 5 departure lounge.
Yeah.
And he said he was just concerned about boarding the plane.
That was the only challenge.
Yeah, that
no
was the
doubt
bit
about where I'm going. Yeah,
absolutely. And he was happy about being on the plane and going. And he said there was that tear between like leaving loved ones behind, but he knew that where he was going. But it was actually that boarding the plane when he gets called for the plane. And I felt that has stuck with me. Those words.
What struck me towards the end, we've talked a lot about hope beyond this life. You've shared with so much hope and conviction about your son, and Richard did, his hope and his excitement of heaven. But he also talked about part of his hope was just that this life ends, and he was okay with that. He was exhausted.
Yeah.
And there is a lot about life, and the suicide is something that's talked about so much, isn't it? That people have just had enough. And obviously part of hope, part of our faith is that we believe in life in all its fullness, but we've got to be real about the fact that this world can suck, life can suck. People have enduring illnesses, people have physical, mental problems, have emotional problems, relationally things difficult, financially things are difficult. And actually, I think in episode 2 or 3, I said, heaven is not just an eternal rerun of this.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. So there's a hope that these things come to an end. But Richard's last words, not on this earth, but to us in the podcast. So actually some of his final words, what a privilege, was Jesus is real, whether you feel him or not.
Yeah.
And we think that's a good place to start this episode because we want to focus on, not only grief, but bringing together. We've talked about addiction, we've talked about mental health. How do we keep the hope alive? And feelings ebb and flow. What were some of your reflections on that?
Well, I was thinking about the feelings, what you were saying then. I was thinking people are made in the image of God. So God designed us to have feelings. So in many ways, we shouldn't ignore our feelings.
Right.
But then in other ways, we should actually measure our feelings. We can't rely on our feelings because we can have an emotional response to a situation or something we hear or whatever's happening around us. So in some ways, we need to measure, don't we? We need to handle our feelings. We need to learn how to understand them. I guess.
There's a cartoon, isn't there, Inside Out? I don't know if you've seen it. It's a Pixar, and it's just helping the next generation with their emotional intelligence. And I think that we live in a society now where we've maybe gone to the other extreme, perhaps reacting against the old-fashioned way of buttoning the lip and, the British way.
Stiff upper lip.
Stiff up, that's it, not buttoning your lip.
Yeah.
But I think there's a healthy thing in that, definitely.
Yeah.
We are emotional. We are emotional beings that is God-given. And there's great protection against pain and all sorts of things in our emotion.
And things like danger as well. I mean, we have emotions to prevent us
doing the same thing again and again.
Yeah, and making us scared. We want to be scared of some things, don't we? Because we don't want to step out on the middle of a motorway or whatever. We're made to be scared because it makes us cautious.
And to be sad.
Yeah.
To guard our heart for future relationships and situations which could be the same.
Yeah.
And yet, if we over-identify perhaps with our feelings, because there is something a bit like the sea or a current, they come and go, then we're taking ourselves on quite a roller coaster. And that is, I guess, the message of the world. Richard talked a lot about the world says this, the world says that. And I think perhaps that's just Christian jargon that we're very used to. But for people listening, what do we mean by the world? It's just simply the messaging that is out in society, whether it's through the radio, through films, through magazines. And it's very much, well, how do you feel about that? And it's, feeling about things and being guided by your heart and your instinct. But the heart can be deceptive too.
Yeah. I was going to say it's about feeling them, but not letting them rule you. Wow. I wonder if that's like the difference. Do you know what I mean? So you have feelings and you can feel them, and that can be good, bad, whatever, a response to a circumstance. But actually it's when they rule you and that they're your true north. I think when we put feelings as our true north, I think that's when we can become misguided.
There are facts that remain true regardless of how we feel. And that's part of hope, isn't it? That's part of what Richard talked about, that there are times, and you talked about in your podcast, where it just felt very dark. And I guess what you're reflecting on there is an experience of like, almost, God, where are you? And we've definitely talked about our testimonies, which can be powerful. So you had this overwhelming sense of God's love holding you through those last days. Richard talked about when he prayed being wrapped up by God. I talked about crying out to my ceiling when I was struggling with drug addiction and being filled with peace. But we don't always experience God that way. Over time, as we mature in this journey, we also need to rely on what is true, the facts, and not only the feelings. You had a great analogy of counterfeit money. Why didn't you share that?
Oh yeah, so we were talking about, I think I've heard it a few times now, but I've definitely heard it spoken in sermons about bank tellers who, when they're being trained, they're asked to just feel hundreds and hundreds of different notes and things like that. And it's because they're not looking for the bad note, the note that is a counterfeit. It's the genuine note. They need to become so familiar with a genuine note that they can recognise a wrong note when they come across it, just by feel, by touch.
Because there's so many different gangs out there. There's so much money in circulation, which is false. And you could try and learn what all the counterfeits are like, but that would take you a lifetime. But the simple solution is get to know the true feel, the true look, and anything that doesn't look and feel like that is a counterfeit by definition. Yeah. And I think that's what Richard was touching on. And we've got to remember that, haven't we? Yeah. Because we do have good days and bad days.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's how we are as well. I think we need to become sort of self-aware. I think self-awareness is really important as well, just in a way of maintaining like a sense of hope, or living in a sense of hope, or a sense of, positivity, I guess, really, living in a life, managing life.
Yeah. This too shall pass was something we used to say to each other when I was early in my recovery from addiction. This too shall pass. It's a feeling. It's a bad day. I used to have my damage limitation days, where I was like, I'm just not in a good space. And actually, the moment I acknowledged that, particularly with the people close to me, it's like it took the power out of it a little bit. It's just one of those bad days. And that just made those relationships a bit easier. My damage limit, don't make big decisions today. Yeah. This is just one of those days. And it could be because of sleep patterns. It could be chemical imbalance. Yeah. It could be the weather. People get that sad, don't they? We're just about to get into autumn now. Sunshine, immune deficient. I don't know sad
disorders. It's
something to do with sunlight. The fact is it gets dark.
Yeah.
And
people don't.
People are down a bit more.
Yeah, they don't. I know some of that is biological, isn't it? Because actually we're not getting the vitamin D from the sunshine. So like our absorptions and things like that of other minerals that our body requires aren't as high.
And while we talk about feelings, I think we can also then talk about thoughts. So one of the Bible verses that have helped me most is take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Now, let's unpack that a little bit, but with a story, first of all. When I was very early on in my recovery from real deep anxiety, depression, panic attacks, someone said to me, actually, not all feelings are facts. And I said to them, but it's like I've got this radio in my head and I don't know where the off button is. I used to call it Radio Robbie. And it just played what it wanted.
Yeah.
And it was like I was at its mercy. And I'd just given into that and resigned to that as a fact. And I speak to so many people who talk about their mental health problems like that, and I know what that's like. But that is a truth from God who made me, so knows my makeup, knows my design. You can take a thought captive. So it's almost a picture of like a quarantine. So a thought comes into the head, and you think, whoa, that's a big idea. That's a big accusation against what I'm like or what they're like. I'm going to put that in a little pen, if you like, a holding cell, or in a almost like a science experiment, and I'm going to observe it from afar.
Like room 101. Do you remember there used to be like a room 101? Stick it in room 101. Yeah.
And I'm just going to look at it and test it against what I do know to be true. Does that really sound like something that God would say about me? Does that really sound like something that I would want them to think about me, what I'm thinking about the other person? And you can put things to the test. Yeah. You can test your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I guess another thing we can think about is that's when the thought is landed. But what about incoming thoughts, as in the things that we're exposing to us as ourselves to? So you touched on it just now. You said something about magazines. And I think there's so much like in the world. There's just this current of lies, isn't there? It's like, what is the world? It's not about image. It's not about money. It's not, although we need to pay bills and we all like to look nice, but there's a balance to be had, isn't there? So I guess there's that filter, our eyes and our ears. We need a filter, don't we, to not allow those things in the first place, because once we let them in, then that's when our minds go off and they latch onto them. Oh, I'm not good enough. Oh, I'm not saying the right thing. I'm not
pretty enough. I'm not rich enough.
Yeah, I'm not fit enough. I'm not fast enough. I don't have the nicest car. But actually, who is it that's telling us that? Wow. And where are we getting that from?
And what's so interesting is that I don't want this to sound judgmental. So I get home in the evening and I don't mind watching a series on TV or whatever.
Like a drama type thing.
Yeah, something like that. Jess actually is much better than me. Jess is like, my job is real enough. I'm on the front line. I see trauma. I see all these things. I don't need any more drama when I get back in the evenings. But I do worry about people who, in order to just decompress at the end of the day, put on certain TV shows. I'm not going to name them, because we're all adults. We can make up our minds what are helpful. But when I hear the things that people watch, on one hand, they're saying to me, I feel really worried about what I look like. I'm really insecure. But on the other hand, you're watching airshot people or people who have 24 hours a day to spend in the gym, looking a particular way. That's a massive contradiction. You can't just watch that and not expect it to have an effect on that. And what is also interesting is they're doing it at the time of day, by their own admission, when their guard is down.
They're vulnerable, aren't they?
When they're most vulnerable. So 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, I'm doing it to switch off. That's okay. But when your brain is switched off, you're not assessing the quality of the information that's going in.
And where you're letting it land.
So
Are you letting it land in your ideals?
I don't want that to sound judgmental, but I just care about people and their mental health. And I think, if things like addiction, things like depression, there's often a root. They're often the manifestations. But if we come back to the root, it's saying, protect your heart and your mind. And there's so much out there that is giving you a message. There's not that many reliable things, to be honest, on TV. I know that sounds really, perhaps that's a bit depressing, but there is some good stuff out there. But I am really putting things to the test now before I just open up my mind and unguard my heart and say, entertain me. Because it's not baseless entertainment.
Yeah,
it has an effect.
Yeah. And actually, when we, like you say, you sit down, you become quite vulnerable because actually you just like, yeah, whatever comes at me. And you become so absorbed. Like if you watch something on the TV, do you become part of whatever that story is on the TV? You almost do. I do. If I watch something, I'm in it. I'm part of it, you know? I was just thinking as you were talking then about like the young people. And when I say young, I mean like those that are under 25.
Young,
I can be young. But I was just thinking it's the level of media, isn't it, that's available. So I think when I was...
Phones.
Yeah. When I was younger, like in teenage years and that kind of thing, it was so compartmentalized because we didn't have mobile phones. Mobile phones didn't come out till I was like in my 20s, or not affordably anyway. But actually nowadays it's there all the time, isn't it? It's there all the time. And this influences as well. I mean, and some influence can be positive as well. I don't want to be bashing people over the head here. Influence can be really positive as well as really negative. But it is like what is influencing us and what and who is influencing us.
So someone said that influence is leadership. And actually, I don't agree with that statement. I think we are being influenced by people. We are being led by people who are influencers over our life. I agree with that. But real leadership is influence plus responsibility. And the danger of these influencers is that they're not actually responsible for your life. They're giving you the content, but where are they when you then become an emotional wreck? Well, they're doing fine, thank you very much. They're living in their nice place or what have you. Whereas really being led and coming back to God is saying, I have influence over you. I want you to listen to my content because it's good. And I'm prepared to back that up by being a responsible person, a presence, an ever presence in your life. And I think if we can test information like this, is this reliable? Are these responsible people? Do I know anything about their own background? I mean, I think back to the 90s and all the people that I used to listen to, the lyrics, the movies, they're all in rehab. Or they're dead. I don't mean that in a callous way. But we were listening to people. And Jesus said that by their fruits you will know them, which is interesting, isn't it? Like, actually, the people that are really going to be influential in your life, don't open your mind and your heart to them unless you really know them.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds such wisdom. That's such wisdom, Rob. It really is. Yeah. The other thing as well, we don't practice silence quite as much, do we? You know, we were talking about this off air beforehand, and we were saying about when I used to stand in a queue years ago, I used to be just stood in the queue, like at Morrison's supermarket, and you would just have a moment just to gather your thoughts and think about, like, just process, I guess, really. But nowadays we don't, do we? And I find myself, like, I pull up in the car, and my husband Carl tells me off this. He's like, the dog's going nuts at the door, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm just answering messages, I'm just checking on this. And I will be honest, sometimes I'm like scrolling and things as well. But we don't ever have that just downtime, that process time, are we? And I wonder where that lies in it as well. Do you practice? Are you silent much of the time? Do you manage to make space for silence?
I use Do Not Disturb on my phone a lot.
Right.
So it's a way that turns off all the notifications on my phone. So one of the things I've noticed, actually particularly in Plymouth more than in other places I've lived, is, and perhaps it's because I've been in Plymouth in the last 8 years, and actually the whole country has become more addicted to their phones than ever. But everyone answers their phone the second it rings. You don't actually need to answer it.
No.
Or just someone messages you. You don't actually need to message back straight away. And the good thing about turning off notifications and the red alerts is that your phone then becomes a tool. Like a lot of things, they can be helpful servants and terrible masters. And I think that describes the phone. Am I in control? Is it my decision when I pick it up? Or is this just like some sort of needy thing that's demanding my attention? Well, no, sorry, I'm going to do it on my terms. And that requires an element of trust. So I have particular times in the day and in the week where I turn off my phone, and it is an agreement with God, because God actually says to us, so we have to believe him in this. He says, Sabbath, rest. So if he tells us to rest, which I know from my mental rest includes turning off my phone, I have to trust God that my children aren't going to go missing during that half hour of my life. Because God's not trying to catch me out or play tricks on me. I just say to God, look, during these times, on those days, the phone's off. Please, can nothing massive happen during those times? And he's always been faithful in that.
Yeah. And we did live without phones before.
We had landlines, mate. Remember those?
Yeah.
Phone
and even
boxes,
before that.
10 pence.
Yeah, I can remember not having a phone at home,
Right.
a landline,
Yeah, you're older than me, though, aren't you, Emma?
I am, yeah. But I can remember not having that. I can remember going down to the corner with my mum to the red the red phone box, just to phone people, family and such like. So I must admit, another thing I've heard of, good practice, is to turn your phone off an hour before you go to bed and not pick it up first thing in the morning. It's quite a challenge though, isn't it? Not to pick it up first thing in the morning.
Again, do not disturb, you can.
Yeah, but this will make you laugh. Yesterday morning, I thought, right, I'll do an online exercise class. How about 6 in the morning?
Come on.
So, yeah, I know, it hurts me to get out of bed. I will not lie. Anyway, so I was meant to get up at 5 to 6. I eventually get out of bed. And I'm like, I'm not going to look at my phone. Anyway, so I get ready, plug all the laptop in. I'm sat there. Anyway, and then I was like, hang on a minute, nobody else is there. And they texted at 6 o'clock to say, sorry, the class is cancelled because there's an outage. It was either Wi-Fi or power cut, which is fine. So then I'm like, yeah, but it still doesn't make me want to check my phone because, you know.
I know somebody who runs a big business and
I had an extra half an hour in my day.
Well, exactly, so it's another win. But this guy I know runs a massive business. He has no notifications on his phone. And he says that in the last 10 years, he's double booked and missed 2 appointments. That's all. Just by checking his emails when he wanted to, checking his messages when he wanted to. He's missed 2 appointments in 10 years. But think of all the things he's given us. Now, we didn't think we'd do an episode about mobile phones. But actually, how many times do we say to our mates, I really must cut down my phone usage? Yeah. Why don't we just say, let's actually do it rather than talking about it? If we know the damage it causes us and the distress and the doom scrolling, the addiction and all those things, the sleep.
Yes.
You know, we talk about hope, depression, mental health. The number of people I check messages at an appropriate time in the morning and I see they messaged me 4 hours ago and I'm thinking that was 3 a.m.
Yeah.
But I do know that people really struggle with sleep and there could be all sorts of reasons for that. But let's give ourselves every chance.
Every opportunity
to sleep. Yeah. Reading a paper book.
Yeah.
It's just... I fall asleep within 5 minutes of reading a paper book. Get into bed at 9:30. Nothing productive can be done after 10 o'clock anyway.
I did hear something. So I was chatting to a friend of mine and she was advising me on some good sleep hygiene, they call it, don't they? And so there's actually like a blue backlight or something on a phone that's designed to stimulate your mind. So if you're looking at your phone in bed, you're stimulating your mind so that when you then try and unwind, it's made in such a way that it kind of sucks you in and you end up watching loads of reels and such like. But actually, we should stay away from our phones for that last part of the day. And like when you get up in the morning, go and stand outside in the cold, fresh air and have a glass of water. That's the best way you can start your day, apparently.
Love it. So let's just go back to this idea. I was talking about having a Sabbath, having a rest.
Yes.
And trusting God that I believe that if he said to me, you can rest, then I can. And he's then in charge of what happens in the universe during those times.
But also, he didn't make you for the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath for
me.
you.
He wants me to rest.
Gift.
It's the rhythm. It helps us sustain life. But coming back to this idea of having faith that, belief that, I think in episode 2, when we were talking about mental health and I was sharing a bit about my journey, is I made this throwaway comment that God knows what's coming around the corner. And he knows me because he made me. So even though things come into my life, thinking about anxiety and fear now, fear is a big word, is that we're scared of bad news, scared that anything can happen. But he already knows it's coming. He knows me. He knows what I'm made of and what I'm not. He knows where I'm at in my journey of maturity and strength and resilience. So if he knows I can handle it, he is a better assessor of that situation than me. So I believe that I can get through today simply because this is the day he's made. He knows me. He knows what's coming around the corner. So yes, when we talk about faith, it's not just faith in God. Yes, there's a God. That's really what Jesus said when he said, believe in me. He said, believe me. Believe what I'm saying. And when it comes to hope and resilience and becoming the person that you want to become, which is real hope, really. And Richard talked a lot about that. We were talking about the analogy of a spotter in a gym. And you went back and you talked a little bit about, you mentioned James and when you first got the diagnosis and you said, I'm not sure I'm ready to handle this yet. Tell us a bit about that journey and how you've believed God. You've believed that you've been able to do things in his timing.
Yeah. I mean, I really believe God gave us an extra 5 years, actually, with James. I really do. So there's a lot, I think generally people can probably relate to things in life where they would say, I couldn't have handled this. I wouldn't have been ready for this a couple of years ago. And we know that God works in us in all circumstances. He brings, he's constantly refining us, constantly growing us, isn't he? And when James was diagnosed in 2016, I can remember pleading with the Lord and saying, and I just had this sense that James, cancer was going to be a big battle for James. And I can remember pleading with the Lord and saying, would you leave? I can't do it. He can't go. Not yet. I at least need another 5 years with him, just at least to get him into his 20s. And really pleading with the Lord. I mean, ultimately, I wanted James to live to be an old man. But I was like, Lord, I just can't manage it. But in that 5 years, God prepared us ready in such a way. And it wasn't about him preparing us. It was about us knowing how close he was and how involved he was in that situation. So the growth came in that direction, so that when James did pass away, we were firm and solid and deeply rooted with Jesus. Wow. Which we weren't. We were believers, but because we'd been on that journey over the 5 years, he'd really grown something in us, so that we could manage with him. Whereas I think 5 years earlier, we wouldn't have been so able to lean on him, because it does take time to learn to trust God, doesn't it? We're bruised and battered by life, and we can be untrusting of other people. And so that can make us untrusting of God at times. And so I think in that 5 years, I learned to really trust God, so that when James did go, I could fully trust him.
So this is a journey from believing in God, believing that there is a God, to believing God, trusting what he's taking him at his word. And this
I think the knowing God, like intimately.
You and Richard both talked about that so clearly, by the way.
Oh, really?
Knowing
God.
And I think I had this image of a spotter in a gym, and sometimes a weight is too much. I remember there's one time I was going to a gym called Muscle Zone in High Wycombe. I was much bigger then than I was
Great
now.
Name.
It was it's where all the bouncers went and everything. It was horrendous place that people used to, mirrors all around, all the guys looking in the mirrors, chucking weights around, starting fights on each other. And I was in a squat machine, and it has like a little lever at the bottom that if the weight's too much, you can hit the pedal and these prongs shoot out, catch the weight, and you can exit the machine safely. Wow. Anyway, it got a bit heavy. I was trying to show off, be stronger than I really was, and I went to hit the pedal for the springs to come out, and I missed it, and I crumpled in this machine. And my mate was the other side of the gym, and I tried to get his attention without getting anyone else's. So I sort of pushed my voice across the gym. His name was Richard as well. I was like, "Oh, Richard!" Hoping he would hear me, and no one else did. And actually, the whole point, God says you can get through today. That's just a fact, whether you feel it or not. My grace is sufficient for today. So he's like that spotter, isn't he? He won't take off all the weight, because he has a goal for your life, like you, to get you stronger, to get you to desire and be satisfied with God above all things, to be strong in him, not on yourself. He has a goal for your life, so why would he take off all the weight? But he knows how much you can take, so you won't crumble. Says, I believe that he knows me. He knows what's coming. Yeah. I think that's so good for our mental health.
Yeah. I mean, and we talked a bit on it last week with Richard as well, like that God grows in us that eternal perspective. I mean, what if this was all that there was? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, does it? If this life is all there is, then none of it makes sense. But when you then put God in and put eternity in, then all of a sudden there's a greater purpose to life.
Yeah.
And it makes so much more sense.
It does.
And not just an empty hope, but actually a purpose to life. Yeah. That actually we're taking part in a very different circumstance, very different interaction, very different circumstance.
And there's purpose in things you couldn't.
Absolutely.
You couldn't put a purpose to. And even I talked a little bit before about there was a missionary called Helen Roosevelt who was very formative in my understanding of life and faith. And she committed her life to Jesus, and she was sent out into the mission field as a nurse, a midwife, I think, originally. And she was sent to the Belgian Congo at the time, and she was raped by loads of rebel soldiers. And she talks very openly, and she has throughout her whole life. She died a few years ago. But in the midst of this most horrendous situation, God said to her, can you allow me to entrust this situation to you, even if I never tell you why? Wow. And she said it revolutionized her idea of the purpose of this life. It wasn't only about trusting God, but that God had things that he wanted to entrust to her.
Wow, that takes some understanding, doesn't it? That takes some understanding. Yeah.
I think it helps with the bitterness, Emma. I think there's something, because this is a broken world, and some things are going to have to happen to certain people. But to be entrusted with those does give them maybe a sense of at least purpose, but also a peace that they're not just happening for no reason.
There's treasure in the unseen, isn't there? Wow. That's kind of what comes to mind, really, that in the natural, where things seem to crumble and fall apart or don't go our way or are painful. We talked about emotions earlier, where they're painful or upset, devastating, and they feel like they're going to destroy you, that even in that, there is this beautiful gem that is being formed, this precious, precious stone in the unseen. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? That's what God's growing in us. That's what he wants to do for us. And yet that's the bit that we can't see.
Wow.
Yeah,
I think I need to think about what that means to be entrusted with particular situations, and even in our life in general. There's a reason for it. We say that a lot, and I think when people lose people, we've got a charity ball this weekend, and there was a sense in which always people want. Obviously, we want to keep memories alive and all these things, but also people often start causes and charities and various things after the death because they want there, as there actually is, to be these things to be meaningful. I think of this sounds like a massive distraction, but one of the Batman films.
Right.
I think it's the Joker films. But basically what happens is you've got all these criminals getting together and they nick all this money from all these banks and they pile it together. And then the Joker comes in and sets fire to all the money. And that scares even the criminals. Because even in their warped thinking, they're like, well, there's a reason for this. We're going to get rich. But when he just even then destroys the money, that's real evil. Evil is just chaos where there's no reason and no purpose. And that is even more scary than even the bad situations themselves. That there would be bad situations and not even a purpose to it, just for the sheer hell of it.
Yeah. I mean, as you were starting to talk then, I was thinking about that verse, if not a seed fall to the ground, then there can't be a harvest. And I was thinking even the seed fall into the ground might be the circumstance that's really difficult, the struggle that somebody's going through. But actually the fruit and the harvest that comes from that, God will always use everything for his good. So he doesn't want bad things for us. He loves us too much for that, but he will permit them so that he can do things for us and with us that he could only be grown in that way. And then that's when you're saying about like the charity functions or the good events or the positivity, whatever it is that comes out of it, that growth is the harvest, isn't it?
Wow. So do not fear.
Do not fear.
So do not fear.
He wins. He wins.
Yeah, good wins.
He wins.
Evil doesn't win. This isn't about chaos. This isn't that we're losing control. And I think there's so much fear around because people watch the news and it all seems so meaningless.
Yeah.
But God's on his throne. Yeah. But going back to the seed, I think that's interesting. We've just made a load of raised beds in our garden, so I'm getting prepared for seeds. But seeds have to die in the ground. I think that's what the Bible bit says, doesn't it? Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it can only remain one seed. But if it dies in the soil, then actually it becomes this amazing plant. But actually, there's so many lessons to be learned from nature. And I think perhaps to wrap this episode up, and we've talked a lot of, particularly at the beginning, about very practical things, phones, minding what you watch, resting, Sabbathing, sleeping. Richard and you talked a lot about journaling in previous episodes. It keeps coming up and I need to get the message.
Are you feeling a bit convicted?
I am. Nature. So many of Jesus' stories come from nature. The parables, but even his stories about being on the sea.
Tossed around in the waves.
But actually, we do need nature. We're so blessed to live in Plymouth, aren't we? By the sea, by the moors. Is that part of your well-being repertoire?
Yeah, absolutely. That and walking. I just love walking, being around in here. Yeah. And this weekend, actually, I went sea dipping again.
I love how you call it dipping. You're actually getting in the water.
I am.
Fair play.
I sent a picture to Carl and he was like, So it was me and some other ladies they went swimming, I dipped, and I went in. It was at North Devon, actually, so went right in and etc. And Carl went, "Why have you got a woolly hat on?" And I was like, "It's to keep warm." So I was just in my swimming costume and a woolly hat. But anyway, but no, so that for me, the nature of that, there is something about being like in that cold water, being on the beach, the vastness, the openness. The sea is a big steadier for me. But even I love flowers as well. So we've got roses in our garden.
Okay.
Oh, beautiful roses. And I think one of them was given to us initially after James died, and it looked like it was a stick in a sandwich bag. Do you know what I mean? Because it was November time, I think. So we planted it and didn't think a lot of it. We're like thankful to the person, but didn't think a lot of it. Put it in the garden. But the next year, the blooms were beautiful. So after that, we've now got lots of roses because we've gone out and like bought a load. But the detail of the roses, it just captivates me.
They don't have to be that detailed. God could have made them plain and we'd still be happy with them.
Yeah.
It's just so extravagant.
But when I look at the buds at every stage, they look amazing. So just looking at that, and even like autumn now, isn't it? The colours of the leaves.
Yeah.
Oh, it's just beautiful, isn't it? The goldens and the browns and the orange, and it's amazing.
Get out. I mean, that's got to be so good for our mental health, hasn't it? When Richard passed away.
Night Sky as well as another one. Sorry, you were going to say Richard.
When Richard passed away, and Jess knew that we were close, Jess bought me some flowers.
Oh.
And
Jess, your wife.
My wife. Yeah. Put it in a vase in the kitchen. I think they weren't particularly posh flowers. They weren't M&S or Waitrose or something.
From somebody's front garden.
No, they were, I don't know, maybe a 3-day shelf life on them.
Yeah.
They lasted 3 weeks until the day of his funeral.
Amazing.
So I took that as a little gift from God. And I took a photo of them. I thought, is this a bit cheesy? I took a photo and I sent them to Kit, one of Richard's sons, who was actually the one who encouraged us the most. Because when we recorded Richard's episode, we thought it's good to honour the family and just say, are you sure this isn't too soon for us to publish it? And Kit emailed back and he said, no, please publish it. Send me the link. And if it helps to tell people these are now passed away since, if that helps spread the word, then all better. I thought, thank you, Kit. That's really gracious. Fine young man. But I sent him a picture of these flowers. With what I said, like, I hope this doesn't come across as cheesy, but I really feel that these flowers, they've lasted a notable 3 days, 3 weeks. I said this is just a reminder, that God's in this day for you, that Richard doesn't perish, and what he's left here on earth is longer lasting than you can imagine. And what a legacy Richard has left behind. Talk about a seed of grain falling to the ground and dying. He's left a legacy on earth. But again, another little beautiful gift. He texts back straight away. They were his favourite flowers.
Wow.
No way just could have known.
Yeah.
So
that
I think
good.
Nature, put yourself in a position to have the best chance when it comes to your mental health, when it comes to receiving and being grateful and cultivating positivity. And I think that's why Jesus spent so much time outdoors. Not because there wasn't anything decent on TV in his time, but he said, take a walk in the garden, actually. He said, notice the flowers, notice the sparrows. They're okay. Yeah. And how much more precious are you?
I've been challenged just recently about what does bring me rest. And I think previously I've always been a bit of a box set lounge lizard, kind of like, oh, that's I'm having a rest, a few hours down. But actually I realise that doesn't bring me rest. It might bring me physical rest.
Right.
But I don't get emotional or psychological rest from that. And I've started to discover a little bit along the Sabbath line, actually thinking around the Sabbath, the day of rest, or a bit of a time of rest. It doesn't have to be a day, but it's just a time carved out where I say, this is my time of rest. That actually it's different. It's other things. It's what fills us up in that time. So I've been meeting with a friend, a very good friend of mine. So I meet with her for a cup of coffee and a chat, or I'll go for a walk, or I will potter in the garden, or just be around.
Fill your tank.
Yeah. And
what are your tank fillers?
Yeah, exactly. Dip in the sea, walk with the dog, those kind of things. Read a book. It doesn't have to be about not doing anything. But what is it that actually brings me rest? Rest isn't a passive activity. Rest can be an activity. It can be something where you're doing, but is it edifying? Is it good for you? Does it recharge you? And that's what I've I've been
And
considering.
get them in the diary, because it's so easy for those things to get pushed out by the busyness of life.
Carve them into your day.
When God said, believe me in this, coming back to this idea of believe God, if he says it, it's good for you. He doesn't just give arbitrary commands to kill our joy. It's good for you. And I remember the analogy, remember, of the jar that's full of sand, and then you try and get the stones in, but you can't, and they're falling out. But actually, if you put the stones in first and then pour the sand in after, they fit in around it, and you can fit much more in the jar. And thinking, okay, I've got a week, I've got a month. Me and Jess sit down on a Monday, first thing, and say, so what have you got on this week? When are you going to do your exercise, Bob? Because she knows that's good for my mental health. If I'm not boxing or football, I spin off at some point in the week. What does Jess need? When are you going to do that with your friends? I mean, you've got to be intentional about this stuff. It doesn't just happen.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It has to be carved into your day or your week or whatever time frame that you're looking at. But we need to invest in ourselves. I mean, I remember that in previous sermons, I've heard this preached about the bucket with the hole in the bottom, that we have to keep filling it up from the top. But if we stop filling it up from the top, eventually it's all going to drain out the bottom and we're going to have nothing left. And then we're going to be in trouble. So we need to keep pouring in on the top end.
And just to finish then, what leaks our bucket is A, living in a broken world. We've talked about that. Just the fact that we are a soul, but we're wrapped in, as Richard says, fragile tissue, which has a certain amount of energy. We're wrapped in emotions and things. We've talked about guarding our minds and our hearts and the TV and things. But I think nothing drains me more than bitterness.
Unforgiveness. Bitterness and unforgiveness.
And I think we need to, to bring this into land today, I think we need to just mention that. Bitterness is such a drain. Jesus talked about forgiving one another. He even talked about the torment that is there for people who don't. I mean, people are tormented out there, and I don't want to lay any more blame at people's doors than they're probably already accusing themselves of. But unforgiveness, bitterness, keeping short accounts. Was that your expression?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Keeping short accounts. So if you feel that you've said the wrong thing, or you're in a bit of a friction kind of situation with somebody, or something's not right, keeping short account, actually talking about that. And it might be that actually that person doesn't want to talk, or that person's not going to forgive you, or they're not going to let that go. But we can do the bit that we can do. So that's almost like, I've heard the phrase of keeping our side of the road clean.
Live at peace. As far as it goes with you, the Bible says, live at peace with others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But also not just keeping short account with other people, but I think keeping short account with God. I think, sometimes when we behave in a certain way, we can allow that to become between us and God. We feel so shameful that we can't, or so embarrassed by our behaviour that we take our eyes from him because we're so disgusted with ourselves, or we're so upset with ourselves. But actually, if we keep short account, I mean, he's full of grace. Jesus has paid the price. He wants relationship with us. He's waiting there with open arms, but it's us that averts our eyes because of whatever behaviour we've done, whatever we've said, however we've acted. So I think
there's something superstitious and religious in a lot of us that think, if I've done something bad, I'll wait till I've done a couple of good things and then I'll go back to God again. It's just not how it works. Jesus said, one of my favourite bits in the Bible, and we talked a lot about rest, we didn't think we would, but he says, come to me. If you're weary and weighed down, I'll give you rest. He says, I'm gentle, I'm humble in heart. I've got rest for your souls. Wow.
We talked a bit about that before as well, didn't we? Psalm 23.
Yeah.
We talked about that. Yeah. He leads me to lie down in green pastures.
And still waters.
Yeah.
He's just not the God that we think he is. He's not like us.
No.
Thank God. Should we leave it there?
Let's leave it there. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Hope and the City. We hope you found it useful, and we're really glad that you've joined us. It would be great if you have any comments, any feedback, questions, or anything that you'd like us to look into in the future. If you'd get in touch on
hope@crplymouth.co.uk. Actually, we're thinking about doing a whole episode dedicated to people's questions and responses to some of the things that have come up. So do interact with us. I've given the email, and on the socials as well, @Hope and the City podcast. Thank you again for listening.